Welcome back to Casuals Corner. It's Will, and let's get straight into the main topic of conversation, which of course is UFC 280. Now, like all good pay-per-views, we had a little bit of everything. We had some upsets, we had some knockouts, we had some submissions, and of course, the special ingredient, a lot of controversy. So, let's start with the big dogs. Islam Makhachev v Charles Oliveira. Now, coming into this, we knew the narrative. The second coming of Khabib. The next person in the heir to Khabib's throne to pick up where he left off and continue the Dagestani legacy of which Abdul Manap Nurmagomedov has put in place for his predecessor to bring on the champion, which is Islam. And then obviously on Charles's side, we know this underdog from the favelas, do Bronx Oliveira, the biggest underdog story probably in UFC history, to be on the absolute tear that he is, steaming through the top 5 of the division, to come head to head. This was one of the most anticipated fights in recent years, is fair to say. And how it played out just spoke to the level of Islam. Like we just said, Charles Oliveira has dusted through the top 5 of this division in a very short space of time. So this was the ultimate proving ground for Islam Makhachev, which was his only criticism and only knock from most fans, is he has fought none of the top of the 155-pound division. Now, let's be clear about something. It was through no fault of his own that he was not getting these matchups. He didn't have much name recognition. He was a horrible stylistic matchup for most people, and people heard the rumours and the stories coming out of AKA and also Khabib's mouth. So it's fair to say that the Dustin Poiriers and the Michael Chandlers weren't jumping at the opportunity to take someone like Islam where there are other better fights to take, which is completely fine. But it was unfair for Islam to get this sort of slack, and he was riding a very impressive 10-fight win streak. Now, it does not matter to me what the names on that win streak are. If you have 10 fights in a row where you have won fights in the UFC, you are clearly of a skill level of not a lot of people in the organisation. That is fact. There is no argument around that. The next knock on Islam was that he had fought no good competition, and Bobby Green and Dan Hooker, his best wins, were on short notice and he should have won to them. Now, whilst I definitely do agree, they were on short notice. They are not the upper echelon of the 155-pound division. The thing that we can say for them is they have been at the top of the 155-pound division consistently for many, many years. So we know that they are tough, they are veterans of the sport, and they are not easy to get out of there in very quick amounts of time, which Islam showed on both occasions. So yes, he should have won those fights, but it's not to say that everyone could have just went in there and had the performance that he had. So when looking at this fight on evaluation after it, I anticipated Islam to have much better striking than people thought. Defensively, I believe he's got the best statistics in the UFC. I didn't imagine his offensive striking to be competitive with Charles, but what I think happened is after that initial grappling exchange, you could see the hesitancy in Charles Oliveira's face, and that opened up some opportunities for Islam on the feet. And also, the same way that Charles is very happy to go gung-ho and go balls to the wall because he knows he has that fallback, it's also the case for Islam. Now, I don't think that he was being very opportunistic and putting himself in danger, but it allows him to be a little bit more free with his hands because he knows he has the fallback of his grappling. He knows that he can level change, and you're in his world now. And the conversation coming into this was about the submission threats and abilities of Oliveira, and we know he's the best we've ever seen in the UFC. But the thing that Khabib did very well was aggressive ground and pound, and he would give you a little bit of separation, which allowed him to posture up and throw heavier strikes. Now, that's less of the style of Islam Makhachev, where he's very positional. He's very methodical in what he works through. He stays very tight, very close to you, and it's hard to get any separation at all. And you only have to hear of the training stories and the people in his corner to hear about that top pressure, to hear about his ability on the ground to sweep, to submit. So that was always a viable option for Islam. But to go in there against the number 3 pound for pound in the world and just dismantle him the way he has should answer absolutely every question in every fan's mind. He is as real as they say he is. Which I kind of knew. Because you have to, when you're evaluating any fighter, you have to look at everything, really. If you're really trying to get to the bottom of who a fighter is, you can't just look at the highlight reels. You can't just look at their fights. You really have to go to every element. How do they fight? What's their style? What's their training camp like? What are their training partners saying about them? What are their habits outside of training camp? Are they very good with recovery? What do they prioritize? How do people speak of them? Are there training stories around them? You have to sort of take a look at every facet of their career to get a bit of a generalized perspective of what they're like as a fighter, as a competitor, as a potential moving down the line. So it's clear to see when you go through all those processes that Islam was never a fraud, realistically. And like I say, I shouldn't even have to say that. He was on a 10-fight win streak in the UFC. But the reason I do say that is because when Javier Mendez came out and spoke about the level and the ability of Islam and how he said that he could be one of the best 155-pounders of all time if he wasn't already, people came out and absolutely ridiculed him. Now, Javier Mendez not only is a very well-credentialed coach, but the likes of Khabib as well, these people have never been known to go on record and speak out of turn about their beliefs within the mixed martial arts world. Now, you can look at them and say they're being cocky or they're being biased because it's their fighter, but pretty much everything they've said up to this point has been followed through. What they said about Khabib, what they said about Islam up to this point, what they said he was going to do to Charles is all very much in effect. So you have to take these takes not with just a grain of salt, but you also have to appreciate who they're coming from and factor that into when you're looking at people like Islam. So naturally that tees up the conversation, who are we going to see next? Now for Charles Oliveira, he is still as dangerous as they come, and take nothing away from him in this fight. He's still going to be an absolute problem for anyone in the division. Now, how long a time off he has, I think he deserves a good 6 months after fighting so frequently and so regularly. But I would love to see him in there with Beneil Dariush. Now, I think that the play is going to be Islam versus Volk naturally in Perth after the call out from Khabib and Islam in the cage, which I think gives a little bit of time to Beneil and especially Islam as well. And I think that matches them up perfectly. Because the truth of it is, Beneil Dariush looked very, very good. We've seen his wrestling capabilities against Tony. We've seen his scrambling ability against Gamrot. We've seen his jiu-jitsu skills, and we know how well-versed he is in the gi, and we know how well-versed he is on the floor entirely. And now he's adding up that stand-up. That's a really interesting matchup against Oliveira, who, like I said, deserves a little break. We've got the Perth card in February, which gives us plenty of time for them to align their timelines and get that fight to be made. And then, of course, for Islam, that Volk fight is the fight to make. Like I said, headlining the Perth card in February. That's a huge main event. Double champ status, #1 pound for pound status on the line. That's a big fight. And the UFC and the brass at the UFC are more than happy to make it, and I think that's the one that they need to do. And of course, closer to the time, we'll discuss the X's and O's of that fight, but I think Volk has a lot better chance than people are giving him, which ties us into our next fight and segues us in nicely to Aljamain Sterling versus TJ Dillashaw. Now, a lot of conversation around this fight was for one of the best bantamweights of all time, and TJ Dillashaw coming into it. Now, of course, we know that he had a long layoff. Of course, we know he's 36 years of age. Of course, we know Father Time is undefeated in this game. Now, of course, the narrative at the end of this fight is going to be the dislocation of the shoulder for TJ Dillashaw. I do not think that it needs to be. Number one, John Anik pointed out on the commentary, and I thought it was a very good point. Part of the fight game is making it to the fight healthy and ready to fight, because that is one of, if not the hardest part of this game. Actually stepping foot into that octagon with no injuries, no niggles, and being ready to compete. That's a very challenging part of the sport. Now, we've even seen Aljamain Sterling have to do that for most of his UFC career, quite honestly, with the neck injuries and the shoulder injuries that he's had coming into it. Which did make me laugh when I heard TJ talking about built-in excuses so that when he beats Aljamain, he has something to fall back on. And the first thing that TJ Dillashaw could say as soon as he had a hot mic in front of his mouth was about the shoulder. Now, of course, I'm not saying he's lying or that didn't happen, but it just felt very hypocritical to me that he jumped straight on the mic and talked about his shoulder coming out for 5 minutes' time, opposed to giving the sort of props to Aljo, which I don't think he was always going to do. But if we circle back to the actual performance itself, I think pretty much from the first exchange, Aljamain Sterling took him down, caught the leg, perfect timing, really, really good reactions and reflexes, caught the leg, took him down, and that's where he dislocated that shoulder, which also stemmed from an action caused by Sterling. So once again, what I didn't like is that I knew this injury was going to overshadow the performance for Aljo throughout a lot of fans. And of course, there's ifs and buts, and the truth of it is, I don't think this fight would have played out any other way. I think that Aljamain Sterling is getting to a place now where he is more comfortable within himself than ever before. Mentally, physically, you can tell that he's maturing in terms of a gamesmanship perspective. He's starting to round out all the skills that he has and not only become a really complete mixed martial artist, but become a really intelligent mixed martial artist, where his shot selection, where his timing of the rounds, where his decisions to get takedowns or to mix it up on the feet or to get people guessing is better than it's ever been before. And one thing that I said coming into this fight, which I thought was going to be a big factor, was the size of Aljamain Sterling, because he cuts a fair amount of weight to get to that bantamweight. And when you see him on fight night, he is a big 135 pounder. He's broad, he's quite tall, he's very, very strong, and you only have to see him when he's clamped onto one of his opponents to see the strength that he's generating. And he's pretty much a lifelong martial artist. He's been in the wrestling room for God knows how long, so we know that he's got that grappler strength as well, and very underrated jiu-jitsu. So when he had him on the floor, you could just see that physical difference, and I feel like no matter how fresh or ready to go TJ would have been for this fight, I felt like that would have played out round on round, which I know of course is easier said than done, but ultimately they both stepped in there, they both signed on the dotted line, and Aljamain Sterling done exactly what he needed to that night to get the job done. Now, whether you like it or not, he has to be in the conversation with the best bantamweight of all time. Now, for me personally, you're going to have Dominic Cruz in there, and of course you're going to have Aljamain Sterling, who now ties the record for most bantamweight wins. And if you have a look throughout the other statistics of the bantamweight history, he ranks in the top 5 for almost all of them. He's got the most ground control of any bantamweight of all time, which is just under an hour and 10 minutes, which is outrageous, by the way. He's in the top 5 for most finishes, most submissions. And when you have a look at his body of work, love him or hate him, you have to appreciate what he's doing in one of the most stacked divisions in the entirety of this sport. Not just the organisation, this entire sport, encompassing all other organisations. So a very impressive night for Aljamain Sterling, and he looked very, very good. Now, the question I've got around Sterling, which is what I was thinking to myself before this fight even happened. I said to myself, if Sterling was to get the W, which I was quite confident in my picks. I wasn't confident in a lot of picks at UFC 280, but Aljamain Sterling to get the job done, I was fairly confident in. Now, the question is, does he move to 145 pounds? Because initially coming into it, obviously he had the controversy around Yan, and then he got that win. And I knew there was something in the back of his head consistently with the weight cut that said that the featherweight option was more viable and more viable every time he went through the grueling process of draining all that water out of him. But I could tell, and I could be wrong, but I could tell that in the back of his mind, he knew for his legacy's sake and for his own sake and peace of mind in the bantamweight division, he really needed to stamp himself as champion. If he just took that second fight with Yan, took the win, and then moved up to featherweight, there were forever questions going to be asked around him and speculation around him being a great in the bantamweight. So I felt like he had to go out and prove again, not only to himself but to the fans, that he is there for a reason before he decides to make that transition. Now, I feel like, even with how it played out, a very legitimate and very good win, I feel like he may take one more. Now, whether that is Chito Vera, whether that's Sean O'Malley, whether that's Corey Sandhagen, if he can nick a win, maybe he doesn't even need a win. Maybe that win over Song Yadong was good enough to put him in there again, but he's already had a couple of shots at the title, and I don't think they're going to be raring to chuck him in off the bat. And if they are to do it very quickly against someone who beat him so dominantly, I don't think that they're going to do it this soon, because then it really hampers his chance of ever getting a title shot again. So it really opens up who's next for him. I don't think he's going to go up to 145 pounds just yet, because I think the timeline with Volk going to lightweight and there has that sort of confusion at 145 pounds, he wouldn't walk straight into a title picture. And I'm unsure whether he would want to take one or two fights at featherweight before he waits it out for the champion. I think he's done enough with his resume to walk straight into that double shot at the title. I believe so. However, do the UFC agree? Do they see his star as bright enough to be able to go and do that? I'm not so sure. As I said, I think he'll take one more at bantamweight, and I would quite like that to be maybe Chito Vera goes straight in there. Maybe he deserves that shot, and then the winner gets Sean O'Malley. I think that could be quite a fun way to do the bantamweight division. However, it's absolutely stacked, and there's no right or wrong answers for that whatsoever. Now, just to touch on TJ before we move on, where does this leave him? To be quite honest, I thought he was going to lay down his gloves in the octagon. After such a long layoff with a serious knee injury, he's had multiple shoulder surgeries. To come in, he turns 37 in February, so very, very soon, in a weight class where speed and age is pretty crucial. Now, if you're 37 in the light heavyweight or the heavyweight division, we know that's a very, very different conversation. But at bantamweight, where there's so many more elements in regards to speed and in regards to reactions, which are much more of a factor, it's difficult to see him being able to go away, heal the shoulder, get a surgery if necessary, take that time off, come in against a top bantamweight competitor and get another win. It's really difficult to see that. But there is one thing about TJ Dillashaw. He is not a quitter, and he has a never say die attitude. So I wouldn't be very shocked if we saw him in that bantamweight picture again. But I don't think it would be at least for another 8 to 12 months. And who's saying that shoulder would even be in a good enough place to repair, heal, and fight again? Which brings us on to our next fight. Again, segues us nicely into the bantamweight division. And this is where the controversy I was talking about steps in. Sugar Sean O'Malley versus Petr Yan. Now, before we get into the X and O's of the fights, I want to say one thing. Sean O'Malley, whether in your eyes he won or lost the fight, ultimately, that is irrelevant. Sean O'Malley answered every single question we had about Sean O'Malley. Now, coming into this, I candidly am a massive fan of Sean O'Malley. Not just because of his fighting style and his bold claims and his knockouts and his Contender Series fight. Not just because of the star he's building in the UFC, but more so outside of that. When you dig into his podcasts and his vlogs and his day-to-day living, you can actually see Sean's an incredibly humble, intelligent, strategic entrepreneur and athlete. You look at the way that he's building his career, he's already implementing a template which many fighters are looking to emulate because it's so strategic and intelligent. Now, of course, you have to be a certain level of fighter and you have to have a certain level of performance every time you come and do that, which he has done up to this point. You have a look at how he handles his recovery and how he handles his training. Now, a lot of people are fooled by the stupid, gimmicky videos he makes with Tim Welch when he's smoking a zoot and hitting the bag with goggles on. But that's the furthest thing from who Sean O'Malley is. And like I said, from a business perspective, you see how he's creating multiple revenue streams and he's helping put his friends on and he's built a house for his friends for them to stream in and Twitch on. And you have a look at all the endeavors he's got outside of the UFC. He's really accumulating this impressive portfolio of not just athletic credentials, but business credentials as well. And I think as the game evolves and continues to grow, more and more people are going to be having a look at that Sean O'Malley blueprint. So coming back to what I said full circle about the questions he had answered, even though I'm a huge fan and I know of the skill level of Sean O'Malley, of course the question was always he wasn't fighting these top contenders and these top ranked guys, but you didn't need to see that to understand he was tremendously skilled. Now, of course, you never know how that's going to translate to the upper echelon of the division until you see it. But it doesn't take a genius to work out that whenever he's fighting these guys, his footwork, his movement, his range, his distance control, his feints, the way that he flows between both stances, the diversity of his attacks, his grappling credentials, if you actually go back and watch him in grappling tournaments, he's an incredible athlete. However, with all that said, the questions I had of Sean O'Malley as a fan of him as an athlete, as a fan of him as a person, what does he look like when he is the nail? That's one of the biggest questions you can have over any talent which is surging through the ranks and basically steaming through every single person they face. You look at someone like Khamzat Chimaev coming into that Gilbert Burns fight. That was the question we needed answered, and he passed it with flying colours and took some humongous shots. Now translate that back to Sean O'Malley. He done the exact same thing. We saw Sean have to be the hammer multiple times throughout his career, but we also saw him have to beat the nail for the first time. Whether that was being on bottom and being on his back and having to work for his feet, whether it was taking huge shots from Petr Yan, who landed a monstrous left hand which cracked his neck all the way backwards till he was looking behind his chin. And the fact that he didn't even get dropped by that showed me a lot. Because the thing I've always had around O'Malley is how much of him is a fighter. I know he's an incredible athlete. He had quite a promising basketball, baseball, athletics career before he even stepped into the mixed martial arts world. His balance, his agility, it translates so well to so many different sports. And I knew he loved to compete. He is a fierce competitor. He loves to win. But I wanted to see how that translated into fighting and how much of a gritty fighter he was. I knew he wanted to win, but how deep of waters was he willing to swim in to get a win? And after we saw that Chito Vera loss, despite how that went down, we still needed those answers from Sean O'Malley. And that's exactly what we got. He said in his post-fight press conference he had to go to places he's never been before. He had to go to somewhere mentally and physically that he's never had to go before and endure shots in a fight that he's never had to do. Now, with Petr Yan, a good performance. He didn't necessarily answer any questions we had around Petr Yan. He didn't really give us anything as fans that we didn't already know. Which sort of brings us on to the question of the actual fight and the decision itself. Now, again, candidly, I must say, when I was watching it, I was very surprised the judges gave it to Sean O'Malley. I was surprised. I picked him to win the fight beforehand. I believed he could squeak out a decision, which he ultimately done. But I believed they were going to give it to Petr. However, when I watched the fight back and I looked at it through a lens of, let me actually score this fight, because when you're watching a pay-per-view and the emotions are jacked up and your adrenaline's flowing and you're watching a highly anticipated fight, I would call most people a liar if they told me that they're watching that perfectly through the lenses of judging criteria. Not many people do. Now, of course, you can give your opinion and they outstruck him and that was that many takedowns, so you can make these sort of assessments on the fly and judge rounds. Of course you can do that, but critically, as a scorer of the sport, can you do that when you're going through that? I don't think so. And I said to my friend when I watched it back, I said there's going to be a lot of people who do not feel as strongly against the decision when they rewatch the fight. And when I did, that's exactly how I thought. The first round is very close. It's a very close round. However, it's quite easy to see how someone sitting there watching that could give it to O'Malley. It was by no means a golf to O'Malley, and it was by no means a clear win in that round for Petr. So it was quite obvious to me when watching that first round again. It's quite easy to give that to Sean O'Malley, and I gave it to Sean O'Malley for the more significant shots. The shots that, even if you want to say Petr weren't hurt, they were cracking him. They were getting through the guard and they were stinging him. And also the way that he shells up and he dips his head, it sometimes makes him look like he's hurt, even if he isn't, which is not a good aesthetic to the judges, which is always a big part of fighting, is how it looks to the judges. Now, the second round quite clearly, quite evidently gave that to Petr. Not a landslide, but a clear round in my opinion. However, the third, it really confused me when I watched this fight back that people were so passionate about this decision, that it was the worst robbery in history. They can't believe what the judges were doing. Now, there are some very bad decisions. However, I didn't think this was a bad decision. And when you watch it back, I think it's quite easy to see how judges would have given the first round and the third round to Sean O'Malley. That's exactly what I scored it myself. Not saying I'm an amazing scorer, but someone who watches a fair amount of fights and listens to people much smarter than myself tell me how judges are interpreting it in regard to the criteria and the effective striking. And this is something that I want to bring in as well, because a lot was made about the ground control. Now, there has been so much made recently of how they are changing and shifting how they view and feedback fights in regards to scoring. Ground control is not given much, if any, emphasis from the scorers if there is no effective striking that goes along with it, or no submission attempts. There was no submission attempts from Petr, and there was little to no effective strikes. Sean O'Malley got to his feet pretty much every time, well, got back to his feet every single time without absorbing any damage, really. Maybe a small hammer fist here and there, but little to no damage. When you have a look in that third round, in the first 2.5 minutes, so you break it up into two halves, Sean O'Malley clearly wins that first 2.5 minutes of action. Now, I'm not coming into this with any particular bias or opinion on either fighter. I'm just speaking objectively. You have a look at that 2.5 minutes. He lands head kicks. He lands 1-2s sharply down the pipe. He lands a huge knee, which splits open and busts Petr, which goes back to the point of the visuals. If we see a fighter that's getting shots landed on them and they're getting opened up, that's a visual cue for the judges, rightly or wrongly. And you have a look at the second half of that fight, second half of that round, you can see that Petr does get a takedown, he does get some control time, but doesn't do anything with it. Which to the judges, they've came out on record and said that they basically score as a change of position. If there's no effective striking that comes from the takedown, they basically score that as a change in position. Now, you cannot tell me that from an effective strikes perspective, that ground control time nullifies the big shots that Petr ate in the third round, specifically in the first half. Now, statistics don't always tell the story, and I'm not one to bring up striking stats and say that's why they won the fight. But also, if you have a look at the significant strikes in the third round, it's Petr 15 to Sean O'Malley's 40. So he's nearly outstruck him 3 times over with significant strikes in the third. Which again, coming back to it, I had no horse in this race whatsoever. I like Sean O'Malley. I was happy to see him win, but I had no horse in the race. I wanted to see a good, fair fight. Now, I don't understand why so many people are confused that that third round was scored to O'Malley. And the fact that people had it 3-0, I was very confused at. However, this is a subjective sport. It has subjective interpretations. Some people know the criteria, some people don't. Some judges know all the criteria, some don't. Some score more towards the criteria, some score more away from it. It's very difficult in this sport to get a general consensus, which you're never going to get. However, the last point I will say on this is I would struggle for the majority of people to go back, and whether they still give it for Jan or O'Malley, I would struggle to say that most people wouldn't go back and feel a lot less strongly against it when they have another look at it. Let's have a look at Gamrot vs Dariush. Now we've got over the controversy, let's have a look at the 155-pound division, full circle, back from the main event. Now, coming into this, I certainly did not overlook Beneil Dariush. Heavy hands, knockouts on the record, incredible jiu-jitsu, incredible submission artist, incredible wrestler. Actually really underrated wrestling, which doesn't get enough appreciation. So I knew that he had all the skills and all the areas of the game to beat Gamrot. However, when I was looking at this matchup to matchup, I just thought that the pacing would be a little bit too much from Gamrot. That's the only divider I could see in this. I know that Beneil has incredible cardio and can really push through that pain threshold. I just thought he was going to be a little bit quicker to the next position and just be able to keep a frantic, crazy pace for the 3 rounds. Now, he was able to do this, but the skill discrepancy was too much. And Dariush, despite potentially losing the first round, really stamped his authority on this fight. Now, I know that Dariush has nice striking and heavy hands. I didn't expect it to look as crisp and as polished as it was. His timing, his anticipation, his movement was really excellent. The base that he set up with in that southpaw position looked really polished, looked really comfortable, had a really comfortable stance, and looked to him, wasn't looking like he was just trying to chase a specific position or submission or anything like that. We saw his crazy scrambling abilities where he was on bottom and managed to scramble through to get knee bars and heel hooks and come out on top every single time, which is really interesting to me because when I had a look at Islam before this fight with Oliveira, I thought if he is to take the belt, which I thought there was a good chance would happen, who is realistically going to challenge him? Because they have to be someone that has all those credentials in the wrestling department, which is someone like Gamrot, who we know has that ability. So I was really keeping my eye close to this. Now, after what we just saw with Dariush, that is now a really interesting proposition for that title fight, if it is ever to materialise with Dariush and Islam Makhachev. Now, coming back to the fight itself, we saw Dariush land huge, well-calculated shots as well. He had that massive left hand that dropped Gamrot, and he had that big step-in knee that he had timing onto that beautiful level change that Gamrot came in with. Because, like I said, we know how frantic and crazy a pace Gamrot can push. But Beneil was too much, because not only could he match the pacing, he could match the skill level and up that another gear. So that was a seriously impressive performance from Dariush, which sets him up for the question of what next. Because let's be honest, he's been massively underappreciated and massively overlooked in this division. That puts him onto an 8-fight winning streak, just taken out another top contender in Gamrot, fighting down the rankings. He finds himself at 6, which makes no sense, being on an 8-fight win streak. And he has all the skills to challenge anyone in that division. So naturally, we're going to have that Islam versus Volk matchup next. But I would love Beneil to get the winner of either of those fights. But in the meantime, if he's not going to sit and wait it out, which I don't think he is, because he is a gamer, he loves to be active, he's just coming off that long layoff, and he's not getting any younger. He's probably just on the cusp of his prime. So he doesn't want to mess about, and I think that Oliveira fight would be an absolute cracker, to be perfectly honest. For Gamrot, I don't think that this is going to be a devastating loss in his career and where this projects him. I think he's still going to be a huge problem for anyone in that lightweight division. And I heard Beneil Dariush on Submission Radio talk about how good he was and how good he felt in there. So I don't think that he's going to have a problem surging through the ranks and making it towards that title picture again. I think it's a minor setback, and I think that we're going to see him come back and make some good adjustments because he has all the skill there. He has that wrestling, he has the submission, he has that nastiness about him, and he has heavy hands as well, and his striking's only getting better. So very impressive win for Dariush, which brings us on to our next fight. We talk about impressive. We talk about shutting fans up. Belal, remember the name Muhammad, v. Sean Brady. Now, there's not many people in this sport, and definitely not on the UFC roster, that get as much hate and abuse and negativity online as Belal Muhammad. And I must say, completely unfairly. The man's on an absolute tear. Whether you love watching his fights or not, the man is on an absolute tear in a difficult welterweight division. Has always been happy to call anyone out. Always happy to fight anyone. People have a very short memory. They like to say no one wanted to fight Khamzat Chimaev and everyone was scared to call him. But there was a couple of people happily calling for his name. Leon Edwards was one of them, and Belal Muhammad was another. He's put his hand up for absolutely everyone. And if you have a look at his last fight against Vicente Luque, who many regarded as an underdog for the welterweight division, a dark horse, for the welterweight division, someone who had previously knocked him out, he went out there and had a very dominant win over him. Now, coming into this fight with an unbeaten prospect in Sean Brady, the narrative coming into this was how hard he hits and how strong he is in the training room and how good his jiu-jitsu skills are, which are all legitimate conversations around Sean Brady. He's a very endearing prospect. He has a lot of skills, a lot of good attributes, and like I said before, I don't think he's going anywhere. I think this is a huge learning experience for him, but it speaks more to the ability of Belal Muhammad, who is probably a higher level than we all anticipated. If we're going to be perfectly honest, we didn't know he had this gear in him. And I must say, I think with working with Khabib, that really helped his game planning and also his mindset coming into this fight. When you have one of the most well-credentialed, legendary fighters in your corner like Khabib, he sees things in fights and fighters that you can't always necessarily see. So when I heard him in the corner and when I heard Belal talk about him being in the corner, screaming at him, finish him, finish him, finish him, he has that killer instinct, Khabib. And he helped get that out of Belal, which is now making him a very, very interesting prospect at this welterweight division. And he can't be ignored anymore because he's got incredible cardio. He's got very, very strong, solid wrestling. And his striking, although is not the prettiest and although not the most complete, he's shown a little bit of everything. He's shown he can go forward, be the aggressor, be the bully, quite literally. Be in your face and take you out that way against a very tough up-and-comer like Sean Brady. We've also seen him on opposite foot, moving backwards, circling around the cage, being the counter-striker against someone like Vicente Luque, who's an incredible striker in himself. So we've seen every aspect of Bully B now, and it really poses the question of who we're going to see him against next. Now, I would love the Colby Covington versus Khamzat Chimaev fight, 100%. Belal Muhammad needs a top contender. He needs one of those top guys. And that title being made between Leon Edwards and Kamaru Usman, most likely in March in England. Colby Covington and Khamzat Chimaev, it's quite clear they want to do that. So now where does Belal Muhammad go? Because it's like a square peg in a round hole. Because he's really proved himself now. And off the top of my head, I'm thinking that I would love to see him in there against Shavkat Rakhmonov. Now, I know once again that'd be fighting down, that'd be fighting an up-and-comer, but that is a fight I would really, really like to see. And if that doesn't happen, I think the fight with Gilbert Burns is a very good one to make, because Gilbert Burns needs a fight, obviously coming off that Khamzat Chimaev. He's still very much in that title picture and that upper element of the welterweight division in Gilbert Burns, and I think that's a very fun stylistic matchup. I would love to see that over 5 rounds. The jiu-jitsu excellence of Gilbert Burns, the pressure and the cardio that Belal Muhammad brings, and the wrestling capabilities, and now the striking. I think that'd be a really, really fun battle. Where does that leave Sean Brady? I feel like that doesn't do much for him other than be a huge learning experience. As I said, he has all the skills. I don't think he trusted in his striking as much as he maybe could have, because he was looking very good in the first round. His 1-2s were very sharp. His left hook was really nice. He had some nice boxing. He didn't really develop off of that. He didn't really put the 3 to it, the 4 to it, the 5 or the 6. He didn't really let those higher combinations go, which is easier said than done when you have someone in front of you pressurizing you. But again, that was his first test at the top of the division. So it's a lot of learning from Sean Brady. And I think that's going to boost his confidence in a weird way. I think that's going to tell him that he knows what it is to be in there, locked in there with one of the top guys in the division, and how close it was for the short time that he was being competitive. So I think he goes away, he adjusts a few things, and he comes back a much, much more improved version. And we talk about Belal Muhammad with Shavkat right there. That's another one that's just eyeing up for Sean Brady. I think that Shavkat Rakhmonov test would be a fantastic watch. And quite honestly, I'm just trying to chuck him in there with anyone because I need to see that man fight, and I need to see him fight someone very legitimate. So, yeah, Sean Brady I don't think is going anywhere. I think he's going to continue growing and evolving. Philadelphia boys have got something really special brewing in there. Obviously, we've got Joe Pyfer coming out of that camp. We've got Sean Brady. There's Andre Petrowski as well. So there's very good talent in that room. And there's hustlers. There's grinders. I don't think they're going to take a loss too heavily and let them dwell on that. So I think he's going to move on and he's going to continue to rise the ranks in the welterweight division. But he just came up against the better man on that night. And the last one for this card that I want to touch on, Muhammad Mokaev versus Malcolm Gordon. I was really surprised when I went on Twitter throughout the fight card and saw the comments that were being made about Muhammad Mokaev. Of course, coming into the UFC, making such bold predictions, you're going to be the youngest UFC champion ever. You're coming in as an undefeated amateur, an undefeated professional. There's going to be a lot of eyeballs and attention around you, and rightly so. And that's exactly where Muhammad Mokaev wants to be. However, I did not anticipate so many tweets about him being a fraud after he just secured a submission win over Malcolm Gordon. Now, if people aren't very familiar with Malcolm Gordon, they should know he's a very well-versed jiu-jitsu practitioner, a very good black belt, and a very difficult fighter to beat, let alone get out of there. Now, I think that fight was a massive learning curve for Muhammad Mokaev, like all of his fights in the UFC have been. And now we've seen a little bit of everything from Muhammad Mokaev. We've seen him with that very quick, dominant submission win against Cody Durden in London, the flying knee to the guillotine finish. We've seen him against Johnson in his second fight, again in London, where he had to go against a very, very tricky opponent, a marathon-level competitor, so crazy cardio, and get a grinding victory and get 15 minutes. And then we saw him come against some adversity in Malcolm Gordon, where maybe he was a little bit overzealous, maybe a little bit overconfident, and we saw him pay the price for that and be in some compromised position. He had to work off his back, he had to work out of uncomfortable places within the octagon, which he hasn't necessarily had to do before. And not only did he do that, he didn't just get a win, he rounded it off with another finish, which now makes that 3 wins in 6 months at flyweight for Muhammad Mokaev coming into the flyweight division, and 4 wins in 2022 for Mokaev at the flyweight division. So now the question is, you have to match him up with a top 15 ranked guy. And you have to appreciate what he's done up until this point. Was it a flawless performance? No. Was it a performance where he was in uncomfortable positions, was also in positions of strength, and had to overcome all of that, got into the third round, and locked up a very slick armbar series? Yes. Which, once again, is not only another finish in the flyweight division, which is impressive, it's more learning experience. You have to remember how young he is, and what he's coming out there and saying he's going to do and executing. It's very, very difficult. So a lot of people were saying he didn't pass the fraud check. If you get a finish over your opponent, no matter how that fight sort of plays out, that's very difficult to do in the UFC. So I can never attach a submission win in the third round with failing the fraud check. I can never do that. And especially not over a win. A win is a win, ultimately, in the UFC. And he's got another one. And now he's looking to carry on the momentum and carry on his undefeated streak and make it 4-0 in the UFC. And I'm very excited to see who they'll match him up with next. Because, yes, he has got a lot to learn. But you can see all the skills are there. The offensive striking, the defensive striking, the grappling, the wrestling. It's all there. It's just about now that experience, controlling the emotions, being able to pick his moments within fights, being able to know when to expend energy and when to reserve it a little bit, when to look for that finish. And he's already starting down that path. So I think it's a very exciting time for Muhammad Mokaev. And he's 100% definitely no fraud in the flyweight 125-pound division. Which brings us on to our fight card next week. And let's just have a look at some of the fights that we have on this, because it's not often that you get such a juicy, exciting fight night card after a pay-per-view. And I will go on record now and say I'm quietly confident that there's going to be a lot of fun scraps in this. Now, I know the name value isn't startling when you have a look at this, but there are some very, very good matchups. None less than Arnold Allen versus Calvin Kattar. Coming into this fight, Arnold Allen on a ridiculous win streak over a very impressive win with Dan Hooker in London not so long ago. Obviously, Calvin Kattar's coming into it on a somewhat up and down road of late in the UFC. He got a very good win over Giga Chikadze. He obviously had that performance against Max Holloway. We know he's at the top of the division. He's got very good striking. He's got good wrestling, really nice boxing. But where is Arnold Allen at? And this is the question which is going to be answered in this fight. The knock on Arnold Allen has always been around the quality of competition. Now, if you actually go through his resume, he's fought some very top guys, but no one as good as Calvin Kattar. And this is what we're going to find out from Arnold Allen. How good is his striking? How good is he as a mixed martial artist? And can he threaten the throne, which is at the moment Volkanovski? Because he has all the skills and all the tools to do so. He comes from a boxing sort of Muay Thai background. And we saw what he can do with his hands when he starts putting it together against Dan Hooker. And he's grappling, again, very, very underappreciated. And I think naturally, because of the person that Arnold Allen is, he goes under the radar. And the interesting thing when I look at this fight and I look at this matchup is, what's the approach going to be from Arnold Allen? Because, of course, this is going to be a 5-rounder at the top of the fight night main event, which he's never had before, against a very, very well-versed Calvin Kattar. A very skillful Calvin Kattar who hits very, very hard and has a ton of experience against the top guys in this division. So how does he play it? Does he come out and try and blitz through him like he did with a Dan Hooker? Or does he come out and try and be a lot more methodical and a lot more strategic, really get a feel for Calvin Kattar and start to build on momentum throughout the rounds and as the fight goes on? Because we know how tough Calvin Kattar can be. One of the best chins in the UFC. You look at the beating that he took against Max Holloway, and even the strikes that he absorbed against Giga Chikadze as well. He's got a fantastic chin, which isn't what you always want to rely on. But Arnold Allen brings this chaotic approach sometimes that it's hard to train for. He throws combinations in flurries, he puts a lot of pressure on, and he comes forward. And this is a really interesting stylistic matchup. And like I said, if he comes through this test and passes it with flying colours, that brings him on to that title conversation. So there's a lot of pressure on Arnold Allen around this fight week. However, just knowing a little bit about him, I know he'll be pretty relaxed. He'll be pretty easy going all week. He won't be building this up to be way more than it is. But this is a big fight. And this is the proving ground. And this is where questions are asked. Because just like we spoke about Belal Muhammad and Sean Brady, this is a similar sort of question. Now, Arnold Allen is a lot more proven than Sean Brady was in regard to the competition. But in terms of that big win streak, Arnold Allen's not undefeated, but he is in the UFC. And then you have a look at him going against a top contender like Calvin Kattar. This is going to be a tricky fight. But I am going to put a prediction out there. I'm going to stay a little bit safer and say that he gets the decision. And although a finish against Calvin Kattar is going to be really, really difficult to obtain, it's not outside the realm of possibility. And I even feel like he has the ability to catch him in quite a chaotic scramble. Whether it's he's pushed him up against the fence, he's landing shots and combinations, and Calvin Kattar's thrown a big elbow or a big overhand, and he just level changes under that, gets into a scramble series and manages to wrap his neck. I wouldn't be surprised at any outcome with this fight, but I'm going to go Arnold Allen and I'm going to go decision. Which brings us on to our next fight on this card, which I'm looking forward to, and I'm just going to highlight the main ones that I'm excited by. Khalil Roundtree v Dustin Jacoby, which is actually a banger at 205 pounds. Dustin Jacoby has been vying for this top 15 fight for a very long time and has been on a very impressive performance streak of late. And Khalil Roundtree, we know the savage nature of himself. We've seen him be extremely destructive in his UFC career. He has extremely aggressive and devastating knockout power. We've seen the damage he can do to people like Modestas Bukalkas, who has only just pretty much recovered from that knee injury. He's a very violent man. Dustin Jacoby, very good kickboxing, but like I said, Khalil Roundtree brings that added scare element to people. And whilst I think Dustin Jacoby is very skilled, and I underestimate him mostly every time I watch him fight, I just think that he's going to be able to be hit by Khalil Roundtree, and he doesn't hold much back. We saw him even utilise soccer kicks in his last fight, and he really has that killer instinct. And I can see this fight playing out where it's a little bit of a stand-up, shoot 'em out, standing in the pocket, boxing sort of exchange, and just getting into a bit of a fist fight, getting into a bit of a brawl. And Khalil Roundtree just has that equaliser of that power, which I think is just going to turn the tide. I don't necessarily think he knocks Dustin Jacoby out cold, but I think I can see a scenario where he clips him in one of these exchanges, stings him a little bit, and then just goes balls to the wall, applies all the pressure, and just empties their gas tank. And when you have someone like Khalil Roundtree emptying the gas tank, it's a very hard thing to, number one, weather, and number two, come back from. Dustin Jacoby is incredibly tough. I think he's even fought Alex Pereira in his kickboxing career. So he's fought some extremely talented guys, and I wouldn't be surprised if he gets through this again and proves me wrong. But for the fact of just what I've seen recently and how I can sort of see this fight playing out, I'm going to go Khalil Roundtree knockout in the second round. I'm going to go Khalil Roundtree knockout in the second round. The next fight on this card that I'm excited about, Chase Hooper versus Stevie Garcia. Chase Hooper is one you need to watch at the featherweight division. It is one you need to watch. When he came into the UFC from his Contender Series fight, Chase Hooper was very much a person which it almost felt like a lot of people looked at him jokingly in the featherweight division because of his stature. He's very long-limbed. He was very scrawny, very skinny. He had an afro. He had really interesting, funky jiu-jitsu. And he wasn't a laughing stock, but he was somewhat of a fighter who wasn't taken seriously to compete at 145-pound division. I think that would be fair to say. However, that couldn't be further from the truth. If we have a look at his last night out, Chase Hooper showed that he has every intention of competing at the highest level at this division and going for that belt. And he has all the skills to do so. His stature makes it really, really difficult for people in that division. Because he's so tall and he's so long-limbed, and because he has such incredible grappling and jiu-jitsu, it's really tough for people. They think they're going to take him down and dominate him because they're going to have this physical advantage, but because of his reach, because of his legs, he scrambles in such weird positions. I saw him last fight reaching over the top of people and just coming out in these scrambles on top every time, because he's able to do unorthodox things. And then you combine that with the fact that he can attack submissions from any position. And then you bolt onto the fact that his striking is actually becoming a lot more polished. He's hitting a lot harder. He's filling out and maturing a lot more as an athlete. I saw him last night out. He's filled out his frame a lot more. He's getting a little bit thicker. He's getting a little bit chunkier. You can see he's getting a lot stronger. And I think he's becoming a real problem. I think he's becoming a real problem in this 145-pound division, and I think he's going to get a win over Stevie Garcia, who's by no means is no mug. I just don't think he's at the level of someone like Chase Hooper, who I think really has a conversation moving forwards at featherweight division. I really, really do. I think after this win, there's going to be a lot of a different conversation around Chase Hooper, and moving forward, I think it's going to be difficult for people to get through him, because like I said, he can threaten in every aspect. And where people thought they could dominate him before by taking him down and being just the big brother, if you like, and bullying and dominating him on top, you can't do that anymore. And when you listen to him speak, he has every confidence in himself to round out his game and to improve as an athlete and to be continually improving his skill set. So I think we're going to see another dominant performance. I think we're going to see a submission win from Chase Hooper. I think he's going to set up with his hands, and when he gets comfortable on the feet, I think he's going to find a way to Stevie Garcia's back, or again, he's going to sort of corral him against the cage. He's going to just vine his legs. He's going to wrap him up. He's going to make it uncomfortable. He's going to have these long limbs pulling across his face, and he's going to have these legs locked into his, and he's going to maybe... I can see a world where he just drags him down to the floor and he gets that body triangle, and then it's just going to be a very, very long night. He has incredible transitions. He goes to top mount. He can take your back. He can throw up triangles, submissions, arm bars, everything. He's got it all in his lock, and then he can even chase your legs. So I'm going to go on record saying a second round submission win for Chase Hooper, and a statement win. I think he's going to look flawless in this performance, and I think there's going to be a lot of eyebrows raised at quite how good he looks and how much of a prospect he is moving forwards. And the last one that I want to bring up, the best name in the MMA world, Phil Hawes. I'll give you a second to mull that one over, versus Roman Dolidze. Now, Dolidze is a very, very good fighter. A very good fighter. Georgian descent, Georgian background, has a lot of different finishes on his card. I think he even got 2 heel hooks in a row in his earlier career. He's got knockouts, he's got submission wins, he's got decisions. He can really do it all, Dolidze. And once again, for Phil Hawes, he's just getting these matchups with people that don't necessarily have name value, but they're very tricky, difficult matchups. And in his last night out, Phil Hawes against Darren Wynn, he dismantled him, quite honestly, on the stand-up. But you heard DC on the commentary say, before the fight had even happened, if Phil Hawes starts putting all his game together, he can really be one of the best 185-pounders in the world. And I 100% agree with that. His most recent loss was against Chris Curtis, and I think he just came into that fight, again, I could be wrong, I think he came into that fight complacent. He saw Chris Curtis a little bit undersized, a very up and down sort of 500 ratio in terms of wins and losses, and I think he came in a little bit overconfident and got his world rocked, quite literally. I think moving forward, we're going to see Phil Hawes maturing much more as an athlete after that loss. He's got incredible wrestling. He's a really, really good wrestler. And you can even see by his physique, he's got that powerful base in his legs. He's really thick. He's got that strength. But also, he's got really nice Muay Thai and striking skills. And we've seen that before. And when he starts piecing it together as a mixed martial artist, he's a problem for anyone. They've got mutual wins in Kyle Dorcas, who Delidze finished in the first round in his last fight, which is, again, a very impressive win. If you're knocking Kyle Dorcas out in the first round, who's a very good striker and boxing himself, this is a really interesting fight. And like I said, don't sleep on this card, because there's some good matchups, and there's some people who maybe have less name recognition but are really exciting in their respective divisions. And I think this is a banger matchup, to be perfectly honest. It's really difficult to call how this goes. I feel like Phil Hawes has that higher skill level. I think he's got the highest ceiling. But this is really going to be the fight for Delidze, who does have losses on his record. He's not perfect. He's got good wins. He's got a wide variety of wins, but he has got losses. He has got some setbacks. This is a big fight. This is a really big fight in the 185 pounds division to say who's next, who can really stamp their mark of saying, actually, you know what, in this division, I'm going to make a name for myself, and I'm going to make a name for myself on this card with a big performance and say, look, if you don't know who I am, get to know. Because Phil Hawes has just been floating. He's been floating in and around there. He got a good win over Darren Wynn, but a lot of people will look over that and say Darren Wynn's very undersized for the division and doesn't have the striking skills to compete with someone like Phil Hawes. But this is going to be a real equaliser. A really, really tough one to call. They both have so many finishes on their record, and they're both such powerful, willing opponents. It's difficult to see this going the distance. I'm going to say Phil Hawes gets the decision. Even though they both have a lot of finishes, even though they're both capable of finishing this fight, I think that Phil Hawes is just going to use that edge and experience that he has under the UFC banner and just edge out a decision. Like I said, I think he's maturing quite well from his losses. He looked very good in his last night out. We know he has that wrestling. He comes from a good camp. I think he's got a lot going for him. But do not sleep on Delidze, and this really could be a coming out party for either fighter. But that pretty much wraps us up. We had an exciting UFC 280, a really, really good card. I'm excited for 281. That's already getting stacked to the gills. And Adesanya v Pereira, that's a massive fight, and we don't know which way that's going to go. This week, we've got Arnold Allen, who, for all of my UFC British fans, you know how much of a big fight this is. He's really going to answer the questions this weekend of how good is Arnold Allen? Can he compete at that upper division? I believe he can. I believe he's got all the skills to do it, and there's no better person to put them against than Calvin Kattar, who is proven at the top of this division. And it's a very, very big week for the British contingency. But thank you for tuning in. As always, I appreciate you. Thank you for the support, the engagement across all platforms. I'll be chopping this up and distributing it everywhere. So keep your eyes out for Casuals Corner. Get involved in the comments. Let me know what you thought of the fault. Let me know what you thought of the controversy. Definitely the Petr Yan-Sean O'Malley fight. Let me know what you were thinking. But yet again, thank you. Look after yourselves. Enjoy the fights this weekend.